The room went silent the instant I set the folder down beside my mother's champagne flute. 23 years of nothing between us, and now here I was, standing in a private dining room stuffed with relatives who'd all gone still at once, like animals sensing a storm before the sky even changes color. My mother had just finished informing the table that I'd turned my back on the family, that I'd swooped in and claimed my grandmother's money for myself. My twin sister sat at the far end, thinner than I remembered, staring hard at her napkin. My father's jaw was doing that thing it always did, grinding on words he didn't have the nerve to say out loud. I laid 2 fingers flat on the folder. I didn't open it. Not yet. What was inside that folder is the reason my parents haven't said a word to me since that night. But if you want to understand how I ended up standing in that room with my hand on the truth, you need to go back to the evening my parents decided that one daughter was plenty. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we tell the family stories that follow you home. I'm your host, and if this one hits close, stick around, because it only gets heavier from here. Let me tell you who I am before anyone else tries to. I'm a large animal veterinarian in a farming town in Wisconsin, the kind of place where the population sign undercounts the cows. I've had my whole arm inside a laboring heifer at 3 in the morning. I've watched calves come out backwards and lived to tell it calmly at breakfast. So when people ask if I scare easily, I laugh. Blood has never rattled me. It's the people who smile while they lie to your face that I have trouble with. My husband is a welder. We lease 40 acres from a local co-op and raise 2 kids who think the whole county belongs to them. We're not wealthy, we're planted. That word matters to me, because there was a long stretch of my life when I wasn't planted anywhere at all. I built everything I have with borrowed tools and stubbornness, and I never once asked the people who raised me for the first 12 years of my life for a dime. They wouldn't have given it anyway. I'd made peace with that a long time ago. Or so I believed, until a Tuesday in February when I was scrubbing antiseptic off my hands at the clinic sink and my phone buzzed with a number from my home state. I nearly let it go to voicemail. Instead, something made me dry my hands and answer. There was a pause. A breath I hadn't heard in over 2 decades. Then a voice soft and careful, the tone you'd use on a spooked animal. "Sweetheart, it's your mother." I set the towel down slow. My mother doesn't call me sweetheart. My mother, as far as I'd known for 23 years, didn't call me at all. I stood in that little clinic room that smelled like disinfectant, and I felt the floor of my carefully built life tilt just slightly off level. Whatever she was calling about, I already knew. Deep in my gut, it wasn't really about me. You don't forget the night your parents hand you off like a piece of furniture they've outgrown. I was 12. It was early spring, and there was a suitcase sitting by the front door that I didn't recognize, except I did, because it was packed with my clothes. I remember the smell of a roast nobody touched that night. My mother sat me down at the kitchen table in that same gentle, rehearsed voice. "You're going to stay with your Uncle Dale for a little while." A little while. I held on to that phrase like a rope over open water. I asked how long. My father, newspaper open in front of him, didn't even glance up. "We'll see." My twin sister was upstairs with a tutor. She'd just placed at the state science fair. There were new ribbons on the refrigerator, a fresh desk lamp in her room, and a feeling settling over that house like the future had arrived, but only had room for one of us in the passenger seat. I wanted on record that I wasn't a difficult kid. I got decent grades. I drew horses in my notebook margins. I just wasn't a prodigy, and in that house, somehow, those had become the same failure. My uncle's truck pulled up around 7 that evening. My mother walked me out with her palm resting light on my shoulder, like pressing any harder might make the moment too real to survive. She kissed the top of my head, told me to behave for my uncle, and went back inside before the truck had even finished backing out of the driveway. I watched the kitchen window as we pulled away. Warm yellow light. I could see her clearing the roast off the table, scraping plates, moving on with her evening like nothing had just cracked in half. A little while turned into the rest of my childhood. But that night, riding in a stranger's truck with the heater rattling, I still believed they'd come back for me. They never did. I need you to understand the arithmetic that ran that household, because everything that happens later is built on it. My parents had twins, and somewhere along the way they started treating us like 2 competing investments. My sister tested into the gifted program early. I didn't. From that point on, the resources flowed one direction. The private tutoring, the enrichment camps, the violin lessons she eventually abandoned anyway. I got secondhand clothes and a library card. Nobody was outright cruel about it, which somehow made it harder to name. My mother carried her own private grief underneath all of it. She'd been accepted into a graduate chemistry program the same year she found out she was pregnant with us, and she never went. She talked about that lost opportunity the way some people talk about surviving a war. My sister was going to become the version of my mother that life had stolen from her, and I was the line item you cut when the budget got tight. I overheard the actual decision once, the year before they sent me away, drifting up clean through the heating vent in my bedroom floor. My mother had asked, quietly, if they were being fair to me. My father's answer came through the metal ductwork as sharp as if he'd been standing beside my bed. We can only fund one future properly. Spread it too thin and we lose them both. I was 11 years old, lying on my bedroom floor, and I just learned exactly what I was worth on a balance sheet. I never told anyone. I just got quiet, and I got very good at needing nothing from anybody. For years I told myself that vent had revealed some secret. It hadn't. It had revealed a decision that had already been made. The suitcase by the door, months later, was just the paperwork finally catching up to the math. My uncle was my father's older brother, and the two of them barely spoke anymore. He'd left the city for a quiet farming community decades earlier, something my father considered a failure of ambition. So when my uncle agreed to take me in, my parents got to tell themselves I'd landed somewhere smaller, somewhere lesser, which made it easier to stop thinking about me entirely. The farm sat 40 minutes outside town, and the first week I cried into a pillow that smelled like someone else's house. My uncle and his wife didn't push. She just quietly set a third plate at dinner every night, like I'd always belonged there. My uncle knocked on my door before sunrise one morning during that second week and said only, "Cows calving. Watch or sleep, your call." I watched. I held the flashlight while he talked a straining heifer through labor in a low, steady voice, and when that wet, impossible calf finally hit the straw and shook its head, something loosened in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. His wife taught me that you feed people whether they've earned it or not. He taught me that you show up at 3 in the morning for creatures who can't ask you to. Neither of them ever once made me feel like overhead. By the end of that first year, I'd stopped flinching whenever someone reached toward me. I made myself a promise out behind the barn one evening, the kind of fierce, half-formed vow only a 12-year-old can make. I swore I'd never need my parents for a single thing again. I'd build a life so solid they couldn't take a brick from it if they tried. I kept that promise for 23 years. What I hadn't planned for was the day they'd come looking, not for one brick, but for the whole foundation. And the only relative who saw it coming was the one I'd assumed had forgotten I existed. Work is what saved me, honestly. By 14, I could give an injection without my hands shaking. By 16, my uncle trusted me alone in the barn. Animals don't grade you on potential. They don't care who won a ribbon. They just need you steady and on time, and I could manage both. Somewhere in there, I decided I wanted to become a vet, and once that decision landed, I chased it the way a dog chases a thrown stick, completely, without looking back. But what still undoes me, even now, are the cards. 3 or 4 times a year, an envelope would arrive at the farm in looping, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside, a card, sometimes a folded $10 bill, and a short note that always closed the same way, thinking of you. Love, Grandma. My grandmother, my father's mother, had decided, against the current of the entire family, not to forget I existed. She never spoke badly of my parents in those letters. She didn't need to. The simple fact that she kept writing said everything the words didn't. I'd write back about the animals. She'd ask their names. When I got into veterinary school, her reply was 4 words. Of course you did. For years, I assumed those cards were the whole of it, a kindness from an old woman 2 towns over, loving me quietly from a distance. I had no idea she was doing something far bigger behind the scenes. I had no idea she was watching, documenting, keeping a record locked away in an old wooden box. And I had no idea how little time was left to thank her until the morning I got the call about her heart. Let me skip ahead, because the good years deserve their own space, brief as it might be. I finished school with more debt than sense and came straight back to the town that had raised me, because it was the only place that had ever felt like mine. I bought into the local veterinary practice when the old doctor retired, then eventually bought him out entirely. I met my husband at a feed store when his truck battery died and mine had jumper cables. We married in a back pasture. My aunt lived long enough to dance at that wedding, 3 months before cancer took her. Then came our daughter, then our son, and a life that on paper looked modest and felt enormous. I had a practice, a marriage, 2 kids who climbed me like a jungle gym, and an uncle gone gray who still showed up for Sunday dinner without fail. I had everything my parents had once decided I wasn't worth funding. And I never sent a single update their way. Not a graduation notice, not a birth announcement. Not out of spite. Out of survival. I'd built a house with no doors facing their direction, and I liked it that way. My grandmother knew all of it anyway, through those cards. She knew my daughter's name and my son's birthday. Her last letter that Christmas read, "You built the thing I always prayed you would." Something they can't ration. I didn't understand that word, ration, until much later. I thought it was just an old woman's turn of phrase. Then came that Tuesday in February. The call about my grandmother came from a number I recognized but a voice that wasn't hers, a nurse at the care facility, calm and rehearsed. My grandmother had suffered a stroke. If I wanted to see her while she could still know I was there, I needed to come now. I left the clinic with antiseptic still on my hands and drove the 40 minutes in 30. Her room smelled like lavender lotion and floor cleaner. She looked smaller than I remembered. One side of her face pulled down by the stroke, but her eyes found mine and sharpened, and her good hand lifted off the blanket reaching. I took it. Her grip was faint but real. "There you are," she said, slow and slurred, using the nickname only she and my uncle had ever called me by. I told her I was there, told her to save her strength. All the useless things you say in that moment. She squeezed my hand hard enough to make me stop talking. She had something to say and not much road left to say it on. The box she managed. Wooden box. At my old house. I leaned in closer. "Things in it," she whispered. "Things you need to know when I'm gone. Promise me, open it yourself. Don't let your father near it." I promised her the moon, honestly. I'd have promised her anything. She held my gaze a long moment, and the working half of her mouth curved toward something like a smile. "Good," she breathed. "Now they can't ration you." That word again. I asked what she meant, but her eyes had already drifted toward the window, toward the flat gray light outside, and her hand went slack in mine. A nurse came in to check the monitors, her expression sliding into that practiced neutrality they train for. My grandmother slept after that. The sleep deepened. 3 days later, she was gone. I never got to ask what she meant. But I'd promised her, and I keep my promises. That's always been my particular flaw. The funeral was small, exactly how she'd have wanted it. A handful of women from her church, a couple of nurses who'd grown fond of her, my uncle leaning on a cane, my husband and me. My parents didn't come. My sister didn't either. 23 years of silence, and they couldn't manage a 3-hour drive to bury the woman who'd raised my father. I told myself I wasn't surprised. Mostly I wasn't. What did surprise me was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, a woman built entirely out of other people's business. She showed up at the reception in a good black coat, dabbed at dry eyes, and within 10 minutes had cornered me by the coffee urn. "Such a loss," she said. She kept to herself at the end, didn't she? Did she ever get her affairs in order? Your mother's just wondering who's handling everything. As family, of course. There it was. They hadn't come to grieve. They'd sent a scout. I told her the lawyer was managing the estate, which was true, and watched that single word, lawyer, land on her like a dropped plate. She recovered fast, cooed something about how it would all work out fairly, in a tone that made clear she intended to personally ensure it was fair to the correct people, then clicked off on her heels to make a call. I stood there with my paper cup and understood something cold and very clear. My grandmother wasn't even in the ground yet, and the family that had spent 2 decades pretending I didn't exist had suddenly, urgently, remembered my address. The only remaining question was how much money they thought was sitting in that box. My grandmother's attorney kept an office above a hardware store, with a radiator that knocked like it had grievances of its own. She'd represented my grandmother for 15 years, which surprised me. I hadn't realized a woman in a care facility kept a lawyer on long-term retainer. She slid a folder across her desk. "Your grandmother was thorough," she told me. "None of this was done in a rush. My grandmother had left me the bulk of her estate, a modest rental property she'd owned outright for decades, and a savings account she'd fed steadily the entire time. It wasn't life-altering money to a banker. To a rural vet still chipping away at student loans with 2 kids at home, it was an entirely different sky. But the lawyer wasn't finished. She set down a sealed envelope with my name across the front in that familiar looping hand, and beside it, a wooden box with a lid worn smooth from handling. The exact box my grandmother had made me swear to open alone. Her instructions were specific, the lawyer said. "You open both the letter and the box by yourself." And she added something I've only drafted twice in 15 years of practice. She looked at me over her glasses. "A no-contest clause. Anyone who challenges the will and loses forfeits whatever they might have received. Your grandmother expected a fight." I asked from whom. The lawyer's face gave nothing away, but she told me plainly to make the paperwork airtight. I drove home with the sealed letter riding on the passenger seat and didn't open it right away. I wanted to be alone, the right kind of alone. I'd barely set the envelope on my kitchen counter when the same out-of-state number lit up my phone again. I let it ring twice while I decided who I wanted to be for this call. Then I answered. My mother's voice poured through the line, sweet as syrup and just as sticky. "Sweetheart, I've been thinking about you constantly. Life's too short, isn't it? We heard about your grandmother, God rest her, and it really put everything in perspective." I said nothing. Silence has a way of making liars keep talking. "Your father and I have regrets," she continued. "We weren't perfect. Nobody is. But you're our daughter, and we'd love to leave the past where it belongs." She let the words settle, then eased in the real ask so smoothly I almost respected the craft of it. "We'd love a family dinner. Everyone together. A fresh start. Will you come? I want to be honest here, because I know some of you would have hung up on the spot. Maybe I should have too. But 23 years is a long time to carry a parent-shaped hole in your chest, and some animal part of me leaned toward that warmth before my brain caught up to stop it. Then I registered the timing. My grandmother, 3 weeks in the ground. An estate freshly in my name. And suddenly, perspective. Suddenly, a fresh start. People don't get sentimental on a schedule. They get sentimental on a deadline. I asked her plainly what had changed. There was the smallest hesitation before she answered. "We're not getting any younger, honey. And family should take care of family. Take care of." There it was, hiding under all that sugar. I told her I'd think about it. She said she loved me, for the first time in 23 years, and it landed on me like spare change tossed to a stranger. I stood in my kitchen looking at my grandmother's sealed letter and thought, whatever's inside that box, I'd better understand it before I sit down at any table they've set for me. I called the lawyer the next morning before I'd finished my coffee and told her about the dinner invitation and the sudden flood of affection. She went quiet the way professionals do when they're choosing words carefully. "I'll tell you the easy part first," she said. "The estate is legally yours. The no-contest clause is solid. You don't owe anyone a dollar or an explanation. And the hard part? Solid doesn't mean painless. If they choose to contest, they can file. They'll lose, but they can drag it out for months. Subpoenas. Noise. They can poison every relationship you have left while it works through the courts." I asked if there was anything I could do to speed things along. She told me the estate had to go through formal proceedings regardless, and that there was already a settlement date on the calendar. Until then, I should keep every record, stay quiet publicly, and sign absolutely nothing anyone handed me. Especially, she added, don't sign anything at a dinner. I told her that wasn't a risk. People who plan dinners like this, she said, are usually planning something bigger than dinner. I'd barely hung up when my phone buzzed again, a text from a number I didn't have saved but recognized instantly in my gut. My sister. We hadn't exchanged a word since we were 12 years old. I know this is out of nowhere. Can we talk? Just us. Please. I stared at that message for a long time. Every instinct told me it was part of the same performance, just a different angle. But there was a rawness to that please that didn't fit the script my mother had been running. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our two lives, neutral ground, like a prisoner exchange. I almost didn't recognize her. She'd been the golden one. The posture, the certainty, the whole aura of a kid who'd been told she mattered. The woman across the table now was hollow-cheeked, careful, dressed in a coat too thin for the season, hands that wouldn't quite settle. She laughed, small and broken, when she saw me. "You look like you turned out okay?" God, that's a relief. I asked why she'd reached out after all this time. She wrapped both hands around her cup like it was the only warm thing left to her, and the story spilled out in pieces. Her business, some education startup our parents had bankrolled and bragged about for years, had collapsed 18 months earlier. Investors. Personal guarantees. A marriage that hadn't survived the fallout. "I'm 34 and living in their basement," she said. "Which is its own particular hell, let me tell you." I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, just the recognition of one exhausted animal for another. Then she said the thing that changed the whole temperature of the table. "I always wondered about you," she admitted. "After you left, I asked Mom once why you never came home, why you never even visited. She told me you'd chosen Uncle Dale, that you liked it better there, that you didn't want to be part of this family." I set my cup down very carefully. "I didn't choose anything," I said. "I was 12. They packed a suitcase and put me in a truck." She went still. Something behind her eyes shifted, some foundational belief losing its footing. "That's not what they told me," she whispered. And right there, in a strip mall coffee shop, I understood the lie was older and bigger than I'd ever imagined. I drove straight from that coffee shop to my grandmother's old rental house, empty between tenants, key cold in my palm. The wooden box sat exactly where the lawyer said it would be, top shelf of a closet, wrapped in one of my grandmother's good scarves. I carried it to the kitchen table, the same kind of table my mother had once used to tell a 12-year-old she was going to live somewhere else for a while, and I sat down. I read the letter first, because I'd promised, and because I needed her voice in my ears before I looked at anything else. "My dear girl," it began, in handwriting gone shaky near the end, but unmistakably hers. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I can finally tell you what I held my tongue about for far too long. I was a coward in one specific way. I watched your parents make their choice and told myself it wasn't my place to step in. I've regretted that silence every day since. I couldn't undo it. So I did the next best thing. I started keeping what they threw away, including the truth." She wrote that she'd suspected, and eventually confirmed, that my parents hadn't just sent me off. They'd taken something with both hands on the way out. "There was money set aside for both of you girls," she wrote. "Equally. I made sure of that while I still could. What your parents did with your half, you'll find in this box. I got the records honestly through the bank, because I had every right to as a contributor. I'm not leaving you my house and my savings to make you rich," she went on. "I'm leaving them to you so you never have to sit at their table and beg for a seat again. You earned your place the day you were born. They're the ones who forgot. Use what's in this box if they force your hand. Don't if they don't. Either way, you're free now. Stand up straight." I read it 3 times before folding it back along her creases. Then I sat in that empty kitchen as the light went long and gold across the floor, understanding that my grandmother had spent her last years quietly building me a shield, one bank statement at a time, in case the family ever came for me. And now the family was coming. The dinner was already set. She'd handed me, from beyond the grave, the one thing they never imagined I'd have. Proof. Here's what the bank records actually showed in plain language, because numbers have a way of hiding cruelty if you let them. When my sister and I were small, an education fund had been opened in both our names. My grandmother's contribution at its core, fed steadily over the years by relatives, and a small inheritance from a great-aunt. Meant to put 2 girls through college. 2. The statements showed steady, even deposits right up until I turned about 13. Then, the year after I was sent away, the pattern shifted completely. Withdrawals began, tuition payments, enrichment camps, a violin, a private high school, eventually a private university. All of it flowing toward a single name. My sister's. My half of that fund, the half with my name legally attached to it, had been drained to nothing by the time I turned 17. They hadn't simply chosen not to spend on me. They'd taken money that already belonged to me and funneled it into the daughter they decided to keep. I sat with that fact for a long while. I thought about every sleepless night doing math on veterinary school loans, every meal my husband and I skipped so we could make a payment on time, every time I told myself the hardship was building character. There had been money. It had my name on it. And dollar by dollar, they'd spent it on a future they decided was worth funding. A future that wasn't mine. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. That's simply not how I'm built. Instead, I did what my uncle taught me to do during a difficult birth. I got steady. I lined the statements up chronologically, noted every date, and began, very quietly, constructing the case my grandmother had already handed me the blueprint for. They wanted a dinner. Fine. I'd come to their dinner, knowing exactly what already belonged to me and exactly how much of it they'd already spent. I brought the box back to the lawyer 2 days later and watched her go through it with the precision of a surgeon. She handled the statements by the edges, made careful notes, and when she reached the manila envelope, opened it, scanned a page, and went completely still. "Where did she get this?" she asked. "The bank. Through legal channels." She nodded slowly. "This isn't just unkind, honey. This account had both of you named as beneficiaries. Moving one beneficiary's full share to the other without consent while you were still a minor, that's not a family dispute. Depending on how it was structured, that's potentially actionable." I asked what that meant in real terms. "It means," she said, "that if your parents are foolish enough to come after your grandmother's estate, they'll be doing it while sitting on a much bigger problem of their own making. People throwing stones from inside a glass house." She set the page down. "I'm not telling you to sue your parents. That's your decision, and it's a heavy one. I'm telling you that you walked in here thinking you had a shield. You actually have a sword too. The only question is whether you ever have to draw it." I told her I didn't want a war. I just wanted to be left in peace with the family I'd actually chosen. She gave me a long look over her glasses. "Then I'd suggest making it very clear, calmly and publicly, that a war with you is a losing proposition. People only respect a boundary they can see the wall of." My phone buzzed with a message from my mother, bright and breezy. "So glad you're coming. Saturday at 6 o'clock, the private room at the restaurant. The whole family will be there. Wear something nice." I looked at the message, then the box, then the lawyer. "She's already picked the stage," I said. "I'll bring the script." I want to be clear that I didn't decide to attend that dinner out of weakness. I decided to go because of where it was being held. My town, not theirs. They were driving 3 hours into my territory to perform for an audience of aunts, uncles, and cousins who had spent 2 decades hearing only one version of me. The difficult daughter, the one who chose to disappear, and now, apparently, the one hoarding her grandmother's inheritance. If I stayed home, that version won by default. If I went, I had one room, one table, and one shot at telling the truth in front of the only witnesses my mother had ever cared about impressing. Her entire power rested on controlling the narrative in front of that audience. So I'd tell my version of it in front of that same audience, in a voice so calm they'd have to lean in to catch it. There's a particular kind of power in refusing to shout when everyone expects you to. I spent the week building a folder. The lawyer warned me against theatrics, just the essentials, laid out in order. The notarized guardianship paperwork my parents had signed when I was 12, which would demolish the lie of my choice. The bank statements showing exactly where my share of the fund had gone. A copy of my grandmother's letter. And, though I didn't know it yet, one more piece was still coming that would turn the whole folder into something undeniable. I practiced what I'd say until it was short, true, and unshakable. My husband watched me rehearse at the kitchen table one night. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," I said. "Then, yes." Both were true at once. Some things you're never fully certain of. You just know they're yours to do. The one thing I was completely certain about was our kids. My daughter had started asking questions about the grandparents suddenly calling. I sat both of them down and explained in kid-sized language that sometimes grown-ups in a family made bad choices and needed time to fix them, and that none of it was about how much they were loved. Then I made the call that cost me something. Our children would not be in that room. Whatever happened at that dinner, they wouldn't be watching from the front row. My husband would stay home with them. He wanted badly to be beside me, and I loved him for it, but I needed him to be the steady ground the kids came home to. And I needed to walk into that room alone. Not as a wife. Not as a mother. As the 12-year-old who'd watched a lit kitchen window from the back of a stranger's truck, finally grown. Finally holding proof. Finally walking back in on her own 2 feet. 3 days before the dinner, my sister texted again, anxious, asking if I was still planning to come, telling me she couldn't stop turning over what I'd told her at the coffee shop. Then, the next morning, the lawyer called with the piece that turned my folder from a shield into something with an edge. I went digging for the original guardianship transfer, she said. When a child goes to live long-term with a relative, there's usually formal paperwork. I wanted to see what story that paper told. She slid a notarized document across her desk, dated the spring I was 12, signed by both my parents, granting permanent custody of me to my uncle. Not temporary. Not an emergency measure. Voluntary and indefinite. In the space provided for the reason, in my father's blocky handwriting, parents unable to allocate adequate resources to both minors. They'd put it in writing. To a notary. The story my mother had fed my sister, that I'd chosen to leave, that I hadn't wanted to be part of the family, was obliterated by a single sentence my own parents had signed when I was a child. I hadn't chosen anything. They'd filed me away like a form. I folded the copy into my bag, and here's the part one want you to sit with, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. My parents had no idea I had this. They believed the only version of events in existence was the one my mother had spent 23 years perfecting. They were about to walk into that dinner and run the same tired script, in front of the same trusting audience, because they still believed I had nothing. That was the last advantage they'd ever hand me for free. From that moment on, I knew exactly how Saturday would end. They didn't. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over you when you're holding the truth and simply watching someone walk confidently toward the edge of it. There was a clock running on all of this. The estate's formal settlement was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 3 days after the dinner. On that date, my grandmother's will would be entered, the no contest clause would lock into place, and everything she'd left me would pass cleanly into my name, unless someone formally challenged it first. The lawyer made sure I understood the stakes. Their attorney has already sent a letter of intent to contest, she told me, citing undue influence over an elderly woman. The same woman they hadn't bothered to attend the funeral for. They were claiming I'd manipulated a dying woman in hospice care. They'll lose, the lawyer said. Your grandmother documented her capacity and her reasoning meticulously. But here's the timing that matters. They want to settle this quietly, before it ever reaches a judge who'd see exactly what they did with that fund. They want you to agree, voluntarily at that dinner, to hand over a share before the law makes your position permanent. It clicked into place, cold and clear. The dinner wasn't a reconciliation. It was a deadline maneuver. Get me into a room full of relatives, apply the pressure of 23 years and 100 watching eyes, and pull a concession out of me before Tuesday made it impossible. They had 3 days. So did I. Meanwhile, my aunt had already gotten to work. Calls started reaching cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Awkward, fishing calls. We just think it's sad Grandma cut everyone out except her. She was always angling for it, apparently. Swept right in at the end. An uncle left a voicemail dripping with concern about how hard my poor parents had tried to reconnect, only to be met with someone cold and money-focused. It was the oldest trick in that side of the family's playbook, and my aunt ran it like a campaign manager, because if my mother was truly a woman who'd given away a daughter, then my aunt had spent 2 decades defending a monster, and she could not afford for that to be true. So she got ahead of it. She ceded the room before I ever set foot in it. The old version of me, the one who needed nothing but also explained everything, would have called every relative and defended herself, sounding exactly as guilty as my aunt wanted. I didn't. I let the whispers build. Every cousin she poisoned was one more witness who'd be sitting at that table Saturday, primed to hear the worst, which meant every one of them would be watching closely when I finally set the folder down. She thought she was burying me. She was building me an audience. I fought the whisper campaign the only way I know how, quietly with paper. I confirmed with the bank in writing that both my sister and I had been named beneficiaries, and that the closing transfers had moved my entire share into accounts under her name. I asked the lawyer to keep the originals locked away and certified copies ready to go. Then I did the harder thing. I called my sister and told her plainly what I'd found. The fund, the guardianship document, the reason written in our father's own hand. There was a long silence on the line, the sound of someone rebuilding an entire childhood in real time. I didn't know, she finally said, voice cracking clean down the middle. I swear to you, I had no idea about the money. They told me you didn't want any of it. She couldn't finish the sentence. I asked if she'd be willing to simply tell the truth, if it came to that, to say what she actually remembered. Another long pause. They're letting me live in their house, she whispered. It's all I have right now. I told her I understood. I didn't ask her to promise anything. You don't hand a drowning person more weight to carry. That same night, my father called, the first time I'd heard his voice in 23 years. No sugar in it, unlike my mother. Just the same flat, transactional tone I remembered from the heating vent. We need this dinner to go smoothly, he said. Your sister's in a hard spot. Family helps family. You've done well for yourself, your grandmother saw to that. It's time to be reasonable and share what's frankly more than your fair portion. I said nothing. Then he delivered the line that proved he hadn't changed 1 degree in 2 decades. We can only invest in one future. You understood that then? Understand it now. He said it like wisdom. Like a proverb. Like the most reasonable philosophy in the world. The exact sentence that had once floated up through a heating vent to an 11-year-old learning her own market value. 23 years later, he hadn't even bothered to update the line. That's the thing about people like my father. They never believed they'd done anything wrong, so they never thought to hide the evidence. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply said, I heard you, Dad. I'll see you Saturday, and hung up. I sat in my dark kitchen afterward and felt something settle into place that I'd been waiting my entire life to feel. It wasn't rage. Rage burns hot and fast and dies out. This was colder and far more useful. It was certainty. For 23 years I'd carried the quiet, gnawing question every discarded kid carries. Was it me? Was there something wrong with me that made me unkeepable? That phone call killed the question for good. There was nothing wrong with me. There was something badly wrong with the spreadsheet they'd run my childhood through, and with a man who, 2 decades later, still believed it balanced. My sister called again the night before the dinner late, her voice hushed like she was hiding in that basement so our parents wouldn't overhear. I can't stop thinking about it, she said. Since you told me, everything's been coming apart. She shared a memory I'd never had access to, because I hadn't been there for it. A few months after I'd been sent away, she'd asked our mother directly why I never came home, why I never even visited. Our mother had sat her down and, in that same careful voice, explained that I'd chosen my uncle over them, that I was happier there, that I simply didn't want to be part of the family. Some people are just like that. Don't take it personally. My sister had believed every word. She was 12 too. Why wouldn't she? She made me think you didn't love us, my sister said, crying now. For 20 years I thought you'd abandoned me. And the whole time you were the one who got. She couldn't finish it. Thrown away, I said quietly. Our mother hadn't just discarded me. She'd rewritten me into the villain of my own sister's childhood, so that no one in that house would ever lie awake wondering if they'd done something wrong. I told her none of it was her fault, that she'd been a child handed a lie by the one person she was supposed to trust completely. Then I asked, gently, what she planned to do at the dinner. A long pause. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I don't think I can keep repeating their version anymore. It was enough. It was nearly enough. The morning of the dinner, I worked my usual Saturday rounds. A colic case, a routine herd check, a barn cat with an abscess. The work steadied me the way it always has. There's no performance for a sick animal. You either help it or you don't. By afternoon I was home, laying the folder out on the bed one final time. First, the notarized guardianship transfer, my father's own handwriting facing up. Second, the bank statements, deposits then withdrawals, dates circled in my own hand. Third, the bank's certified letter confirming both beneficiaries. Fourth, a copy of my grandmother's letter, in case I needed her voice with me in that room. I didn't include anything cruel. No old grievances, no diary pages, nothing built for theater. The lawyer had been clear. The documents work precisely because they aren't emotional. Let the facts do the cutting. I dressed plainly, dark slacks, a sweater my late aunt had knitted me years earlier, because I wanted a thread of her with me too. My husband kissed me at the door, our son waving a fistful of crayons, our daughter hugging my legs and telling me to be brave, which broke and rebuilt something in me in the same second. I was almost to the restaurant when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. A family group text, one I'd been added to days earlier, probably so I'd feel the warmth of inclusion. I glanced at it at a red light. My mother had just sent a message meant for someone else entirely. It landed in the group chat with all 30 of us on it. Once she signs Grandma's share over tonight, we put all this behind us. Don't let her leave without the agreement. Be warm but firm. I read it twice while my heart did something slow and final. There it was, in my mother's own words, sent by accident to every relative in that room. The loving reconciliation. The fresh start. All of it reduced to a tactical instruction. Be warm but firm. I screenshotted it before she could delete it. Sure enough, a minute later, the message vanished. This message was deleted, followed by a flustered apology and a laughing emoji, like a misfired joke. But you can't unsend what 30 people already read. And you definitely can't unsend what I'd already saved. I sat at that green light until the car behind me honked. The folder on my passenger seat had been a careful, surgical thing. Now, finally, it had teeth. I picked up my bag, walked across the gravel lot, and pushed open the door to the private dining room. The space was warm and low-lit, a long table set for 15 under a brass chandelier, the smell of garlic and fresh bread thick in the air. My mother sat at the head in pearls mid-laugh, performing the role of gracious host. My father sat beside her, grayer and heavier than I remembered, jaw already working. My aunt, sharp-eyed, watching the door like she'd been assigned security detail. A scatter of uncles and cousins filled the rest of the seats. My audience, some already shooting me the look reserved for someone they decided to disapprove of. At the far end, small and pale, sat my sister. She caught my eye for exactly 1 second before dropping her gaze to her plate. My mother spotted me and lit up like a stage cue. You came. She crossed the room and hugged me, and I let her, arms loose at my sides, the way you let weather happen to you. She still wore the same perfume from 23 years ago. Over her shoulder, I could see the whole table watching, calculating, running the script they'd already written in their heads. The cold, ungrateful daughter, finally guilt into doing right by family. I let her seat me. I let the warmth wash over the table. I set my bag down by my chair, the folder tucked inside, rested my hand flat on the white tablecloth and waited. My uncle had taught me something else years earlier, in a cold barn at 3 in the morning. You don't rush a difficult birth. You wait for the exact moment the body is ready. Then you pull once clean, all the way through. Dinner arrived in courses, and so did the performance. My mother ran that table like a woman who'd been rehearsing for decades. She toasted family found again. She told a soft, carefully edited story about how painful the years apart had been, how hard I'd always been to reach, shaping the room's sympathy before she'd even made her ask. People nodded along. My aunt dabbed her eyes on cue. I ate my soup and said little, which they all read as guilt. Exactly as intended. Then, over the entree, my mother turned the warmth up and began landing the pitch. You know, she said to the table, though she was really speaking to me, your sister's been through such a terrible time, the business, the divorce. And here we all are blessed. Especially some of us. A glance my way, gentle as a blade. I just think this is a chance for our family to take care of its own. Your grandmother, bless her, wasn't quite herself at the end. She made some decisions that weren't really fair to everyone. But we can fix that. As a family. Tonight. There it was, the turn toward the ask. A cousin murmured agreement. My aunt said, loud enough to carry, it's only right. My father set down his fork. It's the decent thing, Charlotte, he said, using my name for the first time all night. Share what you were given. Make it right. 15 faces swung toward me, most of them already certain I'd refuse and prove I was exactly the cold creature my aunt had spent 2 days describing. My mother reached over and patted my hand. "We're not asking for much, honey. Just sign a little something tonight so we can all move forward." She actually had a paper waiting, folded beside her plate, a pen resting on top. She'd brought her own document into my town, into my restaurant, certain I'd fold under the weight of all those eyes. I looked at the paper. Then I reached for my bag, but I didn't open it yet. I wanted to hear her say the rest, out loud, in front of every witness in that room. So I asked calmly why she thought my grandmother's will was unfair. That was all the invitation she needed. Her face shifted into the wounded saint expression I remembered from childhood, and she addressed the table like she was testifying under oath. "Because that girl," she said, voice catching with rehearsed emotion, "left this family when she was young. She chose to. We tried, we begged, and she turned her back on us. And then when her grandmother was old and confused, she swept in and made sure she got everything, while her own sister has nothing. I didn't want to say it like this, but this family deserves the truth. The truth." She said that word at my table, 3 feet from the folder holding the actual thing. A few cousins shook their heads at me. An aunt made a soft, disapproving sound. My aunt sat back, arms crossed, satisfied, her campaign blooming right on schedule. My father nodded along, grim and righteous. And there it was, the exact moment this whole story opened on. The room gone silent. My mother having just told 15 people I'd abandoned the family and hoarded my grandmother's money. My sister, too thin, staring at her plate. My father's jaw working. This was the room. This was the moment every road since that suitcase by the door had been leading toward. I let the silence stretch. 1 beat. 2. Let them all watch me, the cornered daughter, expecting tears, or a tantrum, or a signature. Then I lifted the folder out of my bag and set it down on the white tablecloth, right beside my mother's wine glass. "You're right," I said quietly. "This family does deserve the truth. So let's start with mine." I opened the folder and pulled out the first page. I didn't raise my voice. I've learned that the quieter you get, the harder people are forced to listen. "This is a guardianship transfer," I said, sliding it toward the center of the table. "Dated the spring I was 12. Signed by both my parents. It grants permanent custody of me to my uncle. Not temporary. Not an emergency. Voluntary and indefinite." I looked at my father. "There's a line for the reason. Would you like to read what you wrote, or should I?" I read it myself, slow and clear, into the dead silence. Parents unable to allocate adequate resources to both minors. I let that sit. I didn't choose to leave. I told the table, told every face that had been fed a different story for over 2 decades. I was 12 years old. My parents signed me over because they decided they could only afford 1 daughter. In writing. To a notary. An uncle picked up the page, eyebrows climbing, and passed it along. My mother's smile had frozen into something brittle. That's taken out of context," she said. "We were struggling. You don't understand the pressure we were under." "I understand it perfectly," I said. "You explained it to my sister. You told her I chose to stay away. That I didn't want to be part of this family." I turned to face her. "Did she tell you that?" The whole table turned toward my sister. She'd gone pale, hands white-knuckled around the table's edge. My mother shot her a look I remembered, the kind that used to end every rebellion in that house before it started. But my sister wasn't 12 anymore, and I could see something 23 years in the making beginning to give way behind her eyes. The guardianship paper made its way slowly around the table, hand to hand, and the room's certainty about me began quietly to come apart at the seams. I gave the room a moment, then reached for the next set of pages. "There's more," I said. "This is the education fund my grandmother helped set up when my sister and I were small. Both our names were on it. Money from relatives, from a great-aunt, and mostly from grandma, meant to put 2 girls through college." I laid the statements out flat, the deposits, then the withdrawals, dates circled in my own handwriting. "These are the deposits. Steady for years. And these," I moved my finger down the column, "are the withdrawals. Starting the year after I was sent away. My half of this fund, the half with my name on the account, was drained to 0 by the time I turned 17. Every dollar went to my sister's tutors, her private school, her college. I kept my voice level. I paid for veterinary school with a decade of debt, eating beans some months to make loan payments, while there was money sitting there with my name on it that my parents spent on the daughter they kept. I looked between them. You didn't just give me away. You spent me. Dead silence. And then my father, God help him, did the one thing that finished it for good. He couldn't stand to be accused without justifying the logic he'd built his whole life around. We did what any responsible parent would do, he said, loud and indignant, to the entire table. You don't waste resources on a long shot. We can only invest in one future. It came out of him exactly as it had drifted up through that heating vent when I was 11, except now there were 15 witnesses, a guardianship document circulating the table, and bank statements laid out on the cloth in front of him. He'd just proudly confessed to all of it in his own voice, in front of the only people whose opinion he'd ever cared about. An aunt covered her mouth. A cousin set the statement down like it had burned her fingers. My mother hissed his name, far too late. He'd authenticated every word I'd said, free of charge. That's when my aunt tried to save the sinking ship, because she'd spent her entire life bailing water out of my mother's boat. She stood halfway up, voice sharp. This is ridiculous. You've twisted everything. You poisoned your grandmother against her own family, and now you're hoarding money and putting on a show. We all know what really happened. She scanned the table for her chorus, the cousins she'd spent 2 days carefully seating. A few wavered, wanting to believe her, because believing her was more comfortable than what was sitting on that tablecloth. So I pulled out my phone. You keep saying I came here in bad faith, I said. Let me show everyone who actually did. I turned the screen toward the table and read the message aloud, my mother's own words, sent an hour earlier to every relative in that room by accident. Once she signs Grandma's share over tonight, we put all this behind us. Don't let her leave without the agreement. Be warm but firm. I looked up. My mother sent that to all of us by mistake, then deleted it. This whole dinner was never a reconciliation. It was a plan to get my signature before the estate legally settles this Tuesday. Be warm but firm. I passed the phone down the table. Cousin after cousin read it and went pale before passing it along. My aunt's mouth opened, then closed, with nothing behind it. The chorus she'd been counting on had just read, in my mother's exact words, the very scheme they'd unknowingly been recruited into. One of the cousins she'd called 2 days earlier looked directly at her. You told me she swept in for the money. This says you all planned this. My aunt had no answer. 2 decades of loyal image management collapsed under a single accidental text, right in front of the very people she'd spent her life whispering to. At the far end of the table, slowly, my sister rose to her feet. She stood there shaking, both palms flat on the table to hold herself steady. Our mother said her name, low warning, the voice that had shut down every rebellion in that house for 30 years. Sit down. This isn't the time. But my sister looked at our mother, then at me, and finally spoke to the whole table in a voice that cracked but refused to stop. When we were 12, she said, I asked Mom where Charlotte went. Why she never came home, never even visited. Her voice trembled. She told me Charlotte chose to leave. That she was happier with our uncle. That she didn't want to be part of this family. That some people are just like that, and I shouldn't take it personally. Tears ran freely down her face now, but her voice kept getting stronger. I believed that for 23 years. I grew up thinking my own sister didn't love me. She gestured at the papers scattered across the table, the guardianship transfer, the bank statements. The whole time they gave her away. They spent her college money on me. And they let me hate her for it, so I'd never ask the questions that actually mattered. She turned to face our mother directly. You didn't just throw her out. You made me believe it was her fault. You stole my sister from me and told me she left. And our mother finally broke. The mask came all the way off. She shot up out of her chair, pearls trembling, the careful hostess voice gone entirely, replaced by something raw and ugly that the whole table had never once been allowed to see. After everything I sacrificed for this family, she shrieked, do you have any idea what I gave up? You ungrateful, both of you. I did what I had to do. She was screaming now, face flushed, in front of every aunt and cousin she'd spent a lifetime performing for. I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the white tablecloth, and let the room watch the woman who'd called me cold finally reveal exactly who'd been cold all along. When my mother finally ran out of breath, the room went so quiet you could hear the chandelier humming overhead. I stood, unhurried, and gathered my papers back into the folder one page at a time. No gloating. My uncle had taught me a long time ago that you don't celebrate over a downed animal. "I'll say this once, and then I'm going home to my children," I said. "I'm not signing anything. Grandma's will is valid. It was made with a clear mind, and it's fully documented. It settles Tuesday, and it settles to me." I turned to my father. "The education fund is a separate matter. My attorney has every record. What happens with that will be decided properly, not over dinner. You moved money out of an account with my name on it while I was still a minor. You may want to speak with your own lawyer before you speak to me again." His face had gone the color of ash. He finally understood that the dinner he'd orchestrated to corner me had instead handed me leverage he couldn't take back. I looked around the table at the rest of them, most of whom had simply been fed a story for 23 years. "The rest of you have been lied to for a long time. I don't hold that against you. I hold it against the two people who told the lie." I picked up the folder. "You spent my whole childhood managing what this family believed about me," I said to my mother. "Tonight, you can't manage it anymore. That's not revenge. That's just what's left once a lie runs out of road." She sank back into her chair, smaller now, the pearls suddenly looking like costume jewelry. My aunt stared at the tablecloth. Nobody at that table could meet each other's eyes. The performance was over, and every person in that room knew exactly who'd been telling the truth. I tucked the folder under my arm. There was only one person left I still wanted to speak to. My sister and I stood looking at each other across the wreckage of that table, two faces that used to be one. Mascara running, hands shaking, a 34-year-old woman who had just burned down her own shelter by choosing to tell the truth in front of the people she still depended on. Part of me wanted to scoop her up and fix everything, the old, over-responsible instinct dying hard. But I've learned the difference between rescuing someone and respecting them. So I didn't offer her money. I didn't offer to make her problems mine to solve. Instead, I took a business card from my pocket, my lawyer's card brought on purpose, and walked the length of that table to place it in her hand. "That's for you," I said. "Not the estate. You. When you're ready to get out of that basement and stand on your own, she knows people who can help you do it the right way." My sister looked at the card, then at me. "I'm so sorry, Charlie. For all of it." I told her she owed me no apology for being a child who'd been lied to. Then I said the thing I'd decided on the drive over, the boundary and the door, both at once. "When you're ready to stand on your own feet, not theirs, not mine, call me. As a sister. Not a bank. Not a rescue. A sister. I'd like that. But I need you steady first. I've spent enough of my life being someone's overhead. I won't make you mine." She nodded through tears, clutching that card like the first solid thing she'd held onto in years. I squeezed her shoulder once, picked up my bag, said a quiet goodnight to a table full of stunned faces, and walked out of that dining room into the clean, cold dark of my own town. I didn't look back. I'd spent 23 years waiting to be chosen. I was finished waiting in doorways. The estate settled that Tuesday exactly as my grandmother had built it to. My parents' attorney, once he learned about the bank statements and the guardianship paperwork, quietly withdrew the intent to contest. No court fight ever materialized. The no contest clause did its job, and the house and savings passed cleanly into my name. Word of the dinner traveled through the family the way these things always do. The cousins my aunt had recruited called me one by one, awkward and apologetic. An uncle sent a card. My aunt herself went quiet, and last I heard, isn't welcome at most family gatherings anymore. Turns out a woman who lies for her sister for 23 years eventually runs out of credit. My mother tried for a few weeks to keep her version of events alive online, a long, tearful post about ungrateful children and everything she'd sacrificed. Almost nobody engaged. The relatives who'd been in that room had already seen the documents and heard my father proudly announce his own philosophy out loud. You can't whisper a story to people who've already watched the truth happen in real time. The fund itself is still working its way through the proper legal channels. It may resolve into something, or it may not. Either way, it's being decided by law now, not by guilt at a dinner table, and I've made peace with however it lands. The money was never really the point. The point was that money with my name on it had existed, and they'd spent it deciding I wasn't worth the investment. Now everyone knew. That knowing was the only restitution I ever actually needed. I drove home that night to a porch light my husband had left burning, 2 kids asleep down the hall, and a life no spreadsheet in the world could touch. About a month later, a formal letter arrived from my parents' attorney, cold, single page. They'd updated their will, it informed me, and wished me to know I'd been removed as a beneficiary of their estate. As if that were meant to wound me. As if there were anything left in that estate beyond debts from a failed startup and a house mortgaged twice over. I read it standing at my mailbox, and I want to tell you exactly what I felt, because it surprised me relief. They'd simply taken back something that had never really been mine to begin with, a seat at a table that had only ever existed to measure me. I signed the acknowledgement without a flicker of hesitation and mailed it back the next morning, dropping it into the same mailbox where my grandmother's cards used to arrive. Then I drove to the clinic, where a farmer was waiting with a sick heifer and absolutely no opinion about whether I was worth keeping. It was one of the best Mondays I'd had in years. My sister called that spring, not for money. She'd used the lawyer's referral, found steady work, and moved into a small place of her own 2 states away. "I'm standing on my own feet," she said. "You told me to call when I was. So I'm calling." We talked for an hour. 2 sisters learning each other again from scratch, carefully, the way you'd approach an animal that's been hurt before. It isn't fixed, 23 years doesn't close over in a single phone call. But the door stays open on honest hinges now, and we use it. She visited the farm that June, watched my kids race across the same pasture where I got married, where my uncle first handed me a flashlight in a cold barn decades ago. She cried, the good kind of crying. My grandmother's old house belongs to us now, rented to a young family who keep chickens and wave whenever I drive past. Sometimes I park across the street and just look at it for a minute, and I quietly thank the woman who spent her final years assembling me a shield out of old bank statements and stubborn love. She's the reason I never had to beg for a seat at my own family's table again. She gave me the one thing they never could. She gave me proof. And with it, finally, peace. If there's one thing 23 years and one folder taught me, it's this: family was never really the people who could afford to keep you. It's the people who never once sat down and did the math. If you've ever been told you were the spare, the long shot, the one they could manage without, you weren't. They were just bad at counting what actually mattered.